Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of our China under Trump series. Today we will be discussing the new trade agreement between China and the US. And joining me to discuss this topic all the way from Washington, D.C. is Josh Meltzer, Senior Fellow at Brookings. Josh, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
So obviously the trade agreement came after President Xi Jinping's visit in the US. It was definitely very much awaited. And I guess the key takeaway points are the fact that the US will now be able to export things like beef and liquefied natural gas to China. On the other hand, China will be able to import by July 16th cooked poultry in the US, but there's also a financial services element to the agreement because the Chinese market will be opened up to US electronic payment services companies, and Chinese banks will reportedly have easier access to the US financial markets. Based on what you've seen in this agreement, who has come out on top? Is it the US? Is it China?
Purely in terms of the market access gains that the agreement addresses, it's certainly weighted in many respects in terms of granting US companies improved market access into the Chinese market. You know, there's, you mentioned financial services, there's possibly going to be improved access also for biotechnology products, beef, and the like. And the main gain on the export side for the Chinese is for cooked chicken. The other way to think about it, of course, though, is that trade openings are generally win-win in the sense that China is looking to improve the efficiency of its financial sector and providing access to payment card operators like Visa and MasterCard, but also there's commitments around opening the market up for a couple of credit rating agencies, which should improve sort of the risk analysis going on in the Chinese market, which is an important step as well to developing greater understanding and credibility around that sector. Is also a gain for China in terms of its ambitions for reform in that sector.
And in terms of some of the, I guess, promises that China included in this agreement, they really do imply a lot of regulatory changes from the China side. And it doesn't necessarily mean these changes are coming immediately. There might be a risk, maybe, that these regulatory changes don't come through. Is this a fair assessment?
We have seen in the past, there's been commitments and promises made in the context, for instance, of the strategic and economic dialogue, which has been a high-level forum for US and Chinese policymakers to meet and to work through barriers to trade and investment, also in the Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade. And promises haven't necessarily translated into market access commitments, particularly when it's required sort of behind the border regulatory steps on the Chinese side. So certainly to make sure that this agreement actually delivers real new market access opportunity, there's going to have to be constant attention and follow through on the US side.
So when the Secretary for Commerce, Wilbur Ross, from the US side says things like this was an amazing achievement for the US, I mean, is that a fair statement to make?
I think it's certainly an achievement. It's probably an overstatement in terms of the way that the administration has described it. This is an agreement which picks off a couple of specific market access issues that have been around for a long time. If you look at the financial services, be it the US took a WTO case against China with regard to access for the card services into that market. So these are issues that have been there for a while. We may be on a trajectory now to resolving some of them, but there is an enormous range of issues, regulatory, tariff, and on the investment side that have not been addressed at all in this agreement and remain to do so.
And I guess in addition to the classic trade agreement per se, after this was announced, there was also a press release or a statement made by the US saying that it recognizes the China's One Belt, One Road initiative. Now, how are we supposed to interpret this? Is it more the US signaling the fact that it is quite keen to maybe step back from a position or a key position of or a key role in terms of security and commerce in Asia and kind of leaving more room for China to fill that gap? Or is it more about China getting actually a further win out of this trade agreement, meaning a US endorsement of this initiative, which actually some big countries like India, for example, are still very skeptical about?
I think that that's a fair way of characterising. There's probably a couple of dynamics at play here. One is certainly that there's a broader form of strategic competition playing out in Asia in terms of the leadership of the engagement of the US and China, both bilaterally, but in terms of the other countries in the region, who's going to be setting the norms, the rules, the standards for economic growth, development and investment in that region going forward. The One Belt, One Road initiative, which, as you noted, as part of this agreement, the US agreed to recognise the importance of, is going to be seen, I think, in Asia as potentially a US willingness to give China additional space to exercise more leadership. The One Belt, One Road initiative, in addition to being an enormous investment in infrastructure and connectivity between China and its periphery, but also really with ambition to extend this all out to Europe, it's both going to be important from an economic perspective, but also is going to tie the region more closely to China, and has clearly got important sort of broader diplomatic and strategic goals in terms of cementing China's sort of growing influence and leadership in that part of the world. And the US recognition of that suggests that the US may be okay with that type of role. And this also needs to be, I think, understood in the context of the administration's decision really in the first day in office to withdraw the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which was the 12-nation trade agreement which had been completed and signed under the Obama administration, and which had explicitly been the United States vehicle for economic and trade and investment leadership in the region. And by withdrawing from that, and in addition to recognising One Belt, One Road, I think has increased uncertainty amongst Asian countries about the type of engagement that the US wants to have in that region going forward.
Perfect. Well, Josh, thank you very much for your insights, and I think this is something, a space we'll still need to keep an eye on. It's definitely just the first step. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.